The first day of the Battle of the Bulge produced a statistical anomaly that has never been satisfactorily explained in the 80 years since it was recorded. An intact U.S. combat element entered the line in the Schnee Eifel and left no trace of its manner of disappearance. Just before dawn on December 16, 1944, the artillery of the German 5th Panzer Army opened with a timed, map-plotted barrage designed to blind, deafen, and paralyze the thin American screen in front of the Ardennes. On the crest lines east of St. Vith sat fresh but inexperienced troops of the 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, holding the least threatened sector in all of Schaeff's December planning. In that sector, between Blyaf and Schönberg, a company-sized element of the division vanished from its assigned frontage before the first coherent radio call ever reached battalion. The physical environment worked for the attacker. Freezing fog cut lateral visibility to a few dozen yards. Snow muted foot traffic, and the wooded slopes diffused sound until rifle cracks sounded like twigs snapping. Cut telephone landlines forced reliance on already weak SCR, 300 and SCR, 536 sets that suffered skip, fade, and battery failures in cold. When the artillery lift ended, the Germans pushed small assault groups forward under a screen of machine gun belts and Nebelwerfer shrieks, and U.S. staffs at corps level began to log, in real time, gaps they could neither see nor explain. The human stress was immediate and nonlinear. Platoons bled leaders early. Medics dragged men on poncho sleds while trying not to silhouette against snow. The young Golden Lions were thrown into first combat in what one officer later called a postgraduate exam with no schooling. The company that would go missing carried standard December issue, M1 rifles with winter trigger guards, bars, M1919 A4S on tripod or snow nest, and a line of trucks back of the wood line, trucks that would later be found burned. In V Corps G3's loose-leaf diary that morning appears the first bureaucratic hint of the mystery, a line of unadorned understatement, unaccounted strength loss. Right subsector 106th. The wording mattered. Front staffs in 1944 did not write missing lightly. They wrote it when bodies, radios, and reports all failed at once. That phrase would recur 3 more times before noon without amplification, forming the archival spine of the disappearance. From the German side, the record is oddly quiet. Kampfgruppe logs are rich in detail about cut roads, bridges, and pockets of Americans assembled into prisoner columns, but no entry describes the capture of a full, intact U.S. company in that grid square in the opening hours. This asymmetry, U.S. record of a loss with no bodies, German record of no gain, would grow more conspicuous as the operational dust settled. The episode demonstrates a perennial staff lesson. Early phase shock produces informational vacuums, and those vacuums can harden into permanent historical blanks when no primary trace is created in the first hours. The first reporting wave is destiny, an Allied analyst wrote later in winter, meaning that what fails to be observed in the first interval is rarely reconstructed with confidence after. That maxim holds today in other domains: aviation mishaps, cyber intrusions, even mass casualty forensics, where missing early telemetry leaves investigators forever inferring from fragments. Once an event exits the zone of observation, causation hardens out of reach. As dusk closed on day 1, battalion tried to re-establish contact by runner and by sound, firing short, controlled clips into the woods to elicit return fire, a crude battlefield locating method. No answering fire came. The frontage the company had held remained acoustically and visually dead, neither enemy occupied nor friendly defended, an unlit patch on the map in a day otherwise full of noise. When night orders circulated, the day ended with a sentence more chilling than a casualty count: disposition unknown. In a war of paper, wire, and bodies, the disappearance of all 3 in one coordinate was not merely rare, it was operationally anomalous. And the next morning, when the fog lifted, the puzzle would deepen, not resolve. When dawn broke over the Ardennes on December 17, 1944, the fog still clung low over the snow-covered pines. The gunfire had quieted, leaving behind an eerie silence. Patrols from the 424th Infantry Regiment moved cautiously toward the sector once held by Company G of the 106th Division. They expected to find casualties, perhaps prisoners, certainly evidence of a fight. What they found instead was worse, nothing that made sense. The trucks were there, blackened by fire, and still warm to the touch. The shallow foxholes were intact. Rifles leaned neatly against logs as if men had simply stepped away for a moment. Rucksacks had been dragged, ration boxes torn open, and Garand clips lay scattered in the snow. But there were no bodies, not a single American nor German corpse in sight. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Lieutenant Charles Harmon, a platoon leader from the 423rd, later wrote in his diary, "It was like walking into a ghost position. You could still smell cordite, hear the echoes, but no men, no struggle, just absence." His words were never included in the official after-action report. To headquarters, the situation looked like confusion under fire. To the men on the ground, it felt like an unnatural void left by something precise and deliberate. By midday, patrols pressed further east toward Schönberg, hoping to link with stragglers. Instead, they found a faint trail of boot prints, a column moving in formation, north by northeast, away from the U.S. line and deeper into contested territory. The pattern suggested discipline, not panic. But halfway down a wooded draw, the prints simply stopped where the snow became trampled mud from artillery impact. No bodies, no direction, no trail continuing forward. The 106th's regimental command, under Colonel Charles Cavender, faced an impossible tactical puzzle. Radio operators had received no distress calls, no SOS, no Morse blips from any surviving sets. The possibility of capture loomed, yet German units nearby denied taking large prisoner groups. Even intercepted German radio chatter from the previous night failed to mention a successful roundup in that grid sector. It didn't align with their operations log, an inconsistency that gnawed at U.S. intelligence officers. One captured German sergeant from the 18th Volksgrenadier Division was interrogated by S.2 the next day. When shown a sketch map of the missing company's position, he reportedly frowned and said, "Amerikaner dort. Nein, nur Rauch und still." Americans there? No, only smoke and silence. His words were dismissed as evasion, yet they matched exactly what the patrols had seen. By the evening of the 17th, frustration turned to unease. The front was collapsing elsewhere. St. Vith was under threat, and the 106th's 2 regiments east of the Our River were already encircled. But this single missing company could not be explained by battle chaos alone. Colonel Cavender ordered a search limited to daylight hours, fearing ambushes in the thick woods. Engineers began marking coordinates where the last known positions had been logged, intending to return once the line stabilized. It never did. In V Corps intelligence notes, a margin entry made by a staff captain stands out: sector, echo silent. Loss pattern not consistent with combat or capture. It was the kind of bureaucratic understatement that only hinted at the shock behind it. In later years, declassified fragments show the same officer recommending further examination when the ground is retaken. That follow-up never made it into the archives. The episode exposed one of the great vulnerabilities of the Ardennes front: the overconfidence of quiet sectors. Units assigned that were green, undersupplied, and spread dangerously thin. When the storm hit, it didn't take much for communication webs to collapse completely. "We were blind to our own front," General Omar Bradley later admitted. The fog was not just weather, it was command blindness. For viewers today, the story reflects how information itself can vanish faster than men. In a world built on reports, signals, and systems, a single point of failure can erase an entire reality, leaving only traces of evidence and a haunting question mark. As night fell on December 17th, reconnaissance patrols withdrew to the relative safety of Schönberg Ridge. The snow fell harder, covering the footprints and the last physical signs of the missing Americans. By dawn, the terrain was smooth again, as though nothing had happened at all. And when an encrypted British intercept from Bletchley Park arrived the following morning, one containing a peculiar German message about priority prisoners, the mystery took a darker and more complicated turn. Before daylight on December 18th, 1944, a slim brown envelope reached the U.S. 1st Army G2 Section, a Bletchley Park Ultra decrypt forwarded with the usual caveat: handled by hand, Do not copy. The message summarized selected German wireless traffic from the previous 36 hours. Among lines about roadblocks and fuel priorities was a short, disquieting phrase. Transfer of priority prisoners. Expedite to Eastern holding point. No unit identifiers. No headcounts. No grid. But the timing aligned almost exactly with the disappearance near Schomberg. That single phrase stopped the analysts. German practice in December 1944, particularly for mass surrenders, produced traceable paperwork, field tallies, interrogation logs, Red Cross notifications downstream. But the phrase, priority prisoners, suggested something outside routine POW handling. Priority for what? And taken where? The Allied side was painfully aware that some prisoners were filtered for intelligence value. Artillery observers, code clerks, radio men, engineers. But Company G carried no known, high-payoff specialists. Their rosters listed ordinary riflemen and squad NCOs. Nothing explained why a line company would be singled out rather than simply bagged, logged, and marched to the rear like thousands of others that week. Meanwhile, on the ground, the battlefield picture worsened. The 106th's sister regiments were being pocketed near the Our River, and St. Vith was entering the furnace. The chaos made disciplined disappearance even more suspicious. At Corps HQ, a captain wrote in the margin of the Ultra Digest, question, who exfiltrated them, and how under fog and fire? Few bothered to answer him. The front was unraveling too fast. Yet the absence of bodies remained the most damning fact. In Ardennes fighting, bodies with a signature of truth, dead defenders, dead attackers, wounded with tourniquets visible, blood trails. Here, none. The trucks were burned, but not cooked with bodies inside. The rifles were present, but no spent brass density consistent with last stand fire. This did not look like men dying in place. It looked like men removed. Late on the 18th, interrogation of prisoners of war, IPW. Team screened fresh German captures. When asked about the missing Americans, multiple POWs from separate regiments independently insisted they had taken no such prisoners in that strip of forest. A lieutenant from the 62nd Volksgrenadier even laughed when shown the map. No American stood there, he said. Your line was empty when we crossed. That comment, recorded in pencil, contradicted U.S. radio logs showing the company present only hours earlier. The disbelief inside U.S. intelligence circles was not cinematic or dramatic. It was colder. The disbelief of professionals who knew what normal looked like and were staring at something that wasn't. An MI5 liaison passing through Spa observed privately. Anomalies you cannot map are more corrosive to armies than casualties you can count. One fragment from the 106th Division's war diary in January 1945, later declassified, contains a striking sentence. The lost signature does not map to annihilation, envelopment, or rout. Those are the only three normal ways companies vanish in war. This one mapped to none. The decrypt from Bletchley remained the only plausible hinge, that the men were seized not as a battlefield prize, but as a controlled transfer for some higher purpose. Interrogation about Allied dispositions, coerced engineering or labor, or exploitation of gear or codes. But if so, the missing piece should have surfaced after the war in German archives, Red Cross lists, or veteran testimonies. It did not. Intelligence officers understood something most civilians learn only after reading history. Mysteries in war do not naturally shrink over time. They calcify. Evidence decays faster than questions. If no document or corpse surfaces early, the probability of final resolution declines each month thereafter. For modern viewers, this is the uncomfortable relevancy. In large systems, wars, states, corporations, the absence of record is not the absence of event. People, decisions, and units can disappear under perfect bureaucratic noise. Once that window of observation closes, truth turns to stratified doubt. By the end of December 18th, the Allied line was too busy bleeding elsewhere to devote resources to a vanished company. The search zone was overrun again as the German drive rolled west towards St. Vith. What little forensic trace remained, the cartridges, the vacant foxholes, the scorched trucks, would be buried under tank tracks and fresh snow by the next sunrise. Yet in London, The Bletchley linguist who translated the priority prisoner's message scratched a private note in his notebook before going off shift. If they are real, they must reappear, alive, dead, or on paper. If they do not, this is something else. He underlined something else. That line, never meant for any report, captures the hinge of the mystery. And when U.S. forces clawed back across that ground in January, expecting graves or tags or frozen bodies, what they found would deepen, not resolve, the anomaly. The ground east of St. Vith was retaken in January 1945 under a gray lit of sky and the rumble of returning U.S. armor. Engineers and infantry, now methodically rolling back the German salient, approached the same coordinates where Company G had last been logged. They came expecting at least the delayed forensic signature of combat. Frozen bodies, shallow graves, shattered helmets, shell-torn limbs under crusted snow. What they found instead were graves, but all of them German. In half-frozen field burials marked by crude branches, exhumers uncovered Volksgrenadier dead with identification discs intact. Not one American lay among them. Surrounding terrain still bore the unmolested debris of the missing company. Canteens, folded shelter halves, unopened rations, preserved as though men had walked off clean and never returned. A U.S. Graves registration, NCO, wrote simply, "Enemy Kia present, Kia absent. Anomaly persists." If the company had died in place, there would have been brass and blood. If it had been captured, there would have been footprints, rumor, or a German record. If it had been annihilated in transit, there would have been wreckage or personal effects dispersed. The absence of all three outcome signatures, death, captivity, transit loss, rendered the event formally unclassifiable. Inside staff tents warmed by pot-bellied stoves, the after-action narrative struggled to cohere. AV Corps Major, confronted with the evidentiary void, coined a phrase in a memo later filed behind a temporary tab. Operationally anomalous disappearance in first 24 hours of Ardennes attack. Such language was unusual in 1944 to 45. Staff prose favored cause-effect verbs, not epistemic shrugs. Years later, a retired G2 analyst would remark in an oral history, what made it intolerable wasn't the loss. Units die in war. It was that it generated no residue. Armies can explain pain. They cannot abide voids. Without residue, the file could not be closed as overrun, could not be tagged as captured, could not be retyped as straggled. The administrative machine had no category for subtraction without trace. For modern readers, there's a diagnostic lesson embedded in this. Reality is usually overdetermined. Wars leave redundant evidence. Human, mechanical, documentary. When evidence sets collapse across all axes at once, what remains is not mystery in a romantic sense, but a forensic insult. The data model itself breaks. Institutions, then and now, are not built to metabolize that. The 106th Division, mauled and humiliated in its first combat, had neither time nor emotional spare capacity to litigate a vanished company. The line was moving west. The war had bigger wounds to staunch. Paper was restacked. The operational anomaly fell behind thicker and more urgent folders. Malmedy, St. Vith, fuel corridors, Elsenborn Ridge. By the time snow melted in spring, heavy vehicles and thaw had erased most remaining surface trace. Bulldozers, road rollers, and new treefall rewrote the ground. When summer investigators returned, they found a sterilized surface. No grave pits, no bone fragments, no uniform scraps, no alternate burial sites downstream. The terrain had been wiped clean by both sides' needs. What had begun on day one as an information gap had now hardened into a permanent evidentiary vacuum. And in Washington, London, and SHEF annexes, one more layer of complication was about to surface. A sealed set of post-war papers, cross-referencing OSS and MI6, hinting that the men may not have died or been taken, but been used under a clause no one would later admit existed. After V-Day, when staffs shifted from fighting to filing, the disappearance of Company G should have resolved in the natural post-war paper flood. Red Cross rosters, POW cards, repatriation interviews, German camp registers, testimonies from liberated Americans. Instead, The trail ended exactly where it had begun, in silence. Not one man from the missing roster ever surfaced as a power knee, hospital case, grave identification, or war crimes deposition. Statistically, such a total void was almost impossible, unless the men never entered the normal POW pipeline. Yet in the archives of CEF, OSS, and MI6, an unexplained pattern appeared. References to missing annexes tied to December 1944 ad hoc exploitation and non-standard retention of personnel for field intelligence use. Pages existed only as cover sheets, content redacted, reels missing, cross-refs pointing to boxes no longer present. In the index of one MI6 post-war volume, a line item reads, U.S. infantry personnel utilized off-ledger. No report filed. See Annexar. Annexar is gone. The suspicion that quietly grew among a thin layer of cleared readers was not supernatural, not sci-fi, not cloak and dagger melodrama, but something far more plausible and far less comfortable. That select Allied commanders may have diverted combat personnel on zero-paper authority to seize, courier, or validate high-value German material under conditions too risky and too time-compressed to route through formal channels. If true, then by definition there would be no signatures, no receipts, no after-action, no subsequent acknowledgement. The missing record would be the design, not the accident. In the 1970s, a retired communications officer, interviewed for an oral history, recalled a rumor circulating in January 45. Some men were taken for a job and never came back. He did not know by whom, nor for what. His remark was neither corroborated nor refuted. It merely hung in the transcript, inert but uncontradicted. In another interview, a division staff sergeant stated, "We were told to stop asking." The tone said, "Stop." Again, no paperwork followed. From a historian standpoint, this lands on a razor. Absence can imply concealment, or merely decay. Most conspiracy theories fail because they add invented data. Here, the anomaly persists because there is no data in precisely the zone where data should exist. That is what makes this case durable. Not rumor, but structured silence where bureaucracy ought to have left fingerprints. There is a modern echo here. In intelligence and special operations today, authorities exist that deliberately remove chain of custody signatures, precisely to prevent post-factum reconstruction. A thing that leaves no audit trail is not necessarily myth. It may be policy. By the late 20th century, Freedom of Information requests produced nothing but missing boxes and page counts without pages. The declassifiers could neither confirm nor deny because they, too, had nothing to hold. The case migrated from wartime lost to archival negative space, an outcome far harder to close emotionally than a list of confirmed dead. Veterans who serve in adjacent sectors kept the story alive the way soldiers do, not with documents, but with a single recurring line in reunions and letters. Those men were taken for something and were never seen again. No one could elaborate. No one could disprove. The wound was not in the body count, but in the epistemology. The war had produced a question that refused to age out. By the end of the century, only one investigative avenue remained: to return to the ground itself, to see whether the soil could tell what the paperwork would not. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as Cold War secrecy thawed and battlefield archaeology matured, researchers returned to the Ardennes Ridge, where Company G was last seen. Using ground-penetrating radar, metal probes, and stratigraphic trenching techniques, they mapped the subsoil for disturbed earth consistent with mass burial. Several pits were found, but all contained German remains, matching the graves previously logged in 1945. No trace layer, no bone scatter, no U.S. artifacts and burial context appeared. The earth confirmed what the papers said. The Americans did not die there. Parallel to the spade work, declassification efforts pulled back box lids on SHAEF, OSS, MI6, and War Department files. The result was not revelation, but absence at scale. Reels missing, annexes referenced yet vanished, folders present but empty. Catalogs still listed them. Physical content did not. The effect was not ambiguity, but a clean void, as if the custodial record had been bluntly amputated along the same boundary that erased the men. Scholars who approached the case in the 2010s arrived at a reluctant consensus. The disappearance does not map to battlefield behavior, to German capture doctrine, to post-war power turns, or to ordinary archival decay. It is a negative in 4 bands at once: tactical, forensic, administrative, and historiographic. What remains is not enough evidence to say what happened, but too much structured absence to believe nothing happened. One archivist, interviewed off-camera, phrased it with clinical precision. "This is not noise. This is engineered silence, or silence born inside an engineered act." That is as close as any responsible historian has come to naming the shape of the unknown. For viewers today, the case carries a sober implication. Even in the most documented war in human history, a U.S. combat company could be removed from both ground truth and institutional memory without leaving reconstructible residue. In an age of sensors, cameras, and digital mirrors, the lesson is sharper. What is not logged in the first window of contact may never be loggable later, no matter the resources applied. By the time the last veteran of the 106th Infantry Division reunion cohort passed, the question was still intact. The families of the missing men never received remains, never received POW confirmation, never received an administrative cause. The war ended, but their file never did. Thus the record closes not with resolution, but with a fixed sentence that no later historian has overturned. A U.S. rifle company entered the Ardennes line in December 1944 and ceased to leave a trace in any known domain of evidence. End of Chapter 6. 6 chapters finished. Waiting for Prompt 3.